or we'll monitor the participation list for you as well, but that would really help us. And with that, Commissioner, I will turn it over to you.
Well,
Commissioner Brain, to begin.
Thank you very much, Denise. I appreciate that. Good day and welcome everybody to the joint meeting of the Innovation, Cybersecurity, and Technology Committee and the Consumer Liaison Committee. My name is Kathleen Bahrain, and I serve as the Maryland Insurance Commissioner and the chair of the H Committee. My co-lead today is Oregon Commissioner Andrew Stolfi, the chair of the Consumer Liaison Committee. We have a lot to cover today, so I'm going to be brief before turning it over to Commissioner Stolfi for opening comments. The goal of today's joint meeting is to continue our discussion and education on the use of big data and artificial intelligence-driven decisional models in the insurance sector. One of the highest priority charges of the Innovation, Cybersecurity, and Technology Committee is to facilitate appropriate levels of coordination and collaboration among NAIC working groups with respect to topics that relate to innovation, technology, cybersecurity, and privacy protection. This charge was a foundational element of the decision to form the H Committee, the goal being to assure, to the extent appropriate, that the NAIC's activities in these areas are identified, coordinated, consistent, and transparent. To that end, the H Committee has developed a collaboration forum methodology, and our initial deployment of that methodology relates to algorithmic bias. As part of that effort, we have engaged in both regulator-only and public educational sessions with the goal of developing a common and core regulatory framework, including a shared vocabulary for addressing the potential for unfair bias and unfair discrimination resulting from AI ML supported decision-making. During the summer national meeting, the Big Data and Artificial Intelligence Working Group and the H Committee heard presentations about AI risk management and governance, as well as approaches carriers can take to manage and mitigate the risk of unintended bias and illegal discrimination when developing and using AI machine learning techniques. But as those of you who attended the H Committee meeting in Portland will recall, our agenda was so packed that we once again ran out of time for meaningful comment and contribution by interested parties. And I committed at that time to hold a virtual meeting before the fall national meeting to provide that opportunity. Now, at the same time, I know that the Consumer Liaison Committee was not able to complete its agenda, and it was equally committed to assuring that the individuals whose presentations were not reached were heard. And since the topics that were not reached included presentations on artificial intelligence and algorithmic bias, Commissioner Stolfi and I felt that it would make great sense for us to have a joint meeting that would include not only prepared presentations by industry representatives and consumer representatives, but also truly ample opportunity for interested parties to speak. And so, Commissioner, let me turn it back over to you for your introductory remarks.
Thank you, Commissioner, and I'll be brief as well. Just want to thank everyone for being here today. Commissioner Bahrain gave a good outline of the issue, and I'm really looking forward to a discussion today. Some presentations, but especially for a discussion. And I just want to say from the Consumer Liaison Committee perspective, how glad I am that we're having this meeting. So those of you who participate with the committee, and if you don't, you absolutely should. But those of you who do know that we've spent a lot of time this year talking about the committee and looking for ways to be more engaged outside of the national meetings. And we discussed and agreed that we should hold interim meetings and focus on other things, and also get more involved with other committees specifically. So really glad that we're following through and having this meeting today, this joint meeting on a very important topic. Look forward to the presentations, and as I said, even more so to the discussion that we're going to have. Thank you.
Well, that is great, and we're very excited to be collaborating with you guys as well today. So we're going to start the joint meeting with presentations on industry approaches to algorithmic bias and the responsible use of artificial intelligence and machine learning. We're going to hear presentations from NAMIC, represented by Tony Cotto, from ACLI, represented by Karen Melkert, and by APCIA, represented by Dave Snyder. So I am going to turn this over, Mr. Cotto, to you. I think that our first two speakers don't have presentations, but our third does. And what I just ask you to do is just go one to the other, and we'll be trying to hold questions this time to the end because I'm very committed, as is Commissioner Stolfi, to make sure that interested parties have enough time to be heard. So we're going to go through our presentations, which will be meaty and full, and then hear from interested parties before we open it up to questions. So Mr. Cotto, let's start with you.
Absolutely. Thank you. Hopefully everyone can hear me. We did the mic check before. So good afternoon. Thank you so much, Commissioner Brain, Commissioner Stolfi, and committee members for the opportunity to present this afternoon. I also want to thank my former colleagues on the NAIC staff, Denise Matthews and Lois Alexander, for their tireless efforts on behalf of the insurance regulatory community on these critical issues. My name is Tony Cotto, and I serve as the Director of Auto and Underwriting Policy at the National Association of Mutual Insurance Companies. On behalf of NAMIC and our more than 1,500 members, we encourage a continued open, deliberate, and deliberative process by the H Committee and all the Collaboration Forum, NAIC task forces, and working groups in concert with your colleagues in state legislatures around the country on the important issues to be discussed today. NAMIC and our members are adamantly opposed to unfair discrimination. As society writ large and governments at every level continue to examine fundamental questions around fairness in the use of consumer data, artificial intelligence, and machine learning, for our part, we continue to urge caution among policymakers as they attempt to develop solutions or mitigation techniques against even the potential for bias in insurance operations. I'm now going to utter the words that I know go over like nails on a chalkboard sometimes in these settings, but which I think are really important. As a former regulator, and I say this not intending to convey some sort of superior knowledge or perspective, but rather to convey humility, because I understand and appreciate the pressures that you as current regulators are facing in your states on the issues before us today, among many others. As your administrations and your legislatures grow restless or demand answers to, well, what are we doing about this? What are we doing on this issue? It is understandable that you want answers and concrete actions to share with them. But much more understanding and analysis of both technology and law need to be completed before rushing into any alleged solutions to societal challenges that are much bigger than insurance. Certainly, we can be part of the call to answer, but many of these problems are much bigger than us, and I think it's always important for us to be humble and realize that. Algorithmic bias stories are making their way into the mainstream press a lot in recent months in a whole host of contexts. I've seen them on talking about judicial sentencing recommendations, questionable Google translation services, promotion of extremist videos on YouTube. Those are just a few examples. I would tell you to Google more examples, but your search results just might be biased. And I kid there half-heartedly, because this is clearly still, it's a very serious issue here. Insurance cannot and should not be exempt from these conversations. At the same time, we can't lose sight of the important features that distinguish insurance and our regulatory system from other consumer products, especially where the law is concerned. In the insurance context, fairness is determined by actuarial soundness and the relation of risk to loss. If two risks are the same, treating them differently is unfair, whether it's done by a computer or a human underwriter or a claims adjuster or anyone in the insurance value chain. Commissioner Borrain, as you so capably and bluntly put it to Congress in your testimony last month, insurers price based on risk. Careful pricing based on risk, coupled with the fact that property casualty insurers do not capture data concerning most protected classifications, actually provides some of the antidote already to the potential for unfair discrimination. Furthermore, since all insurance is prospective in nature, it's generally more appropriate to emphasize the analysis of inputs than attempting to measure any outcomes other than loss ratios, which speak to evaluations and analysis of that effort that we make to match rate to risk. Matching rate to risk promotes accuracy, which is the essence of insurance fairness under insurance codes, a system in which insurers most accurately identify and price risk and charge a commensurate premium. Policyholders benefit from risk-based pricing as insurers compete for business and ensure that lower-risk policyholders are not unfairly forced to subsidize higher-risk policyholders. And the use of more sound factors and data in algorithms make unfair discrimination against protected classes less likely, and improve the fairness of pricing for all insurance consumers. With that said, we agree with what we've heard from several committee members on the need for a common and consistent lexicon of the most important terms in this space, and those terms need to be defined in statute. These are public policy decisions that should follow the legislative process, not just be imposed by bulletins or regulatory handbooks incorporated by reference. We all need to be around the table here, as do our legislators. This effort to develop common terminology will, in and of itself, be a massive undertaking. I'm willing to guess that if I asked all, let's see, we're up to 238 participants on this call. If I asked everyone to define bias, artificial intelligence, machine learning, or fairness, I'd probably get about 150 different answers. And I don't say this to be facetious. We have to make sure we get it right here. The words are going to matter because they are going to determine what follows in terms of legal and regulatory regimes, in terms of compliance with anything that eventually gets put into law, and because the idea of what constitutes fairness is far from universal, contrary to what some may believe. We also agree with the broad principle that artificial intelligence should not be used to conceal or facilitate unfair discrimination. Simply put, if a human did it and it would be illegal, then a machine doing it is also illegal. Algorithms are not some kind of get out of jail free card. When algorithms enhance accuracy, we believe they should be embraced, not prohibited. They should be responsibly and continuously considered and validated for accuracy, credibility, and objectivity by insurers, actuaries, and policymakers. This is the accountability framework that we talk about a lot of times. The inclusion of more risk-based factors in algorithms improve consumer choice by enhancing the accuracy of overall risk assessment. The converse is also true, as I'll warn. Limiting accuracy not only intentionally creates cross-subsidies, but it does nothing to reduce the overall cost of coverage, and it increases reliance on other remaining factors and data points. So as you consider this, there is also a downside whenever you are limiting accuracy. It not only raises prices, but it also hurts access. And I think that is the conversation that all of us really want to be having, because more access, whether, across all of the NAIC's work streams, we should really be talking about access to these products and access to the financial improvements that come from having insurance. This is an area where, one of the few areas where Bernie and I can often talk about agreement. We both believe that access is what really matters. So let's talk about some of the good news and some of what we have going for us already in this space. For the insurance industry and for regulators, the use of data and algorithms is nothing new. Insurance and its regulation are fundamentally a data-driven enterprise. Always has been, always will be. Companies thrive when they're able to use large quantities of data in innovative ways to improve both products and services for the benefit of their consumers. It is the use of data that facilitates improved efficiency, lower costs, and improved customer satisfaction, as insurers use data to improve their processes, reduce friction, and best match outcomes with modern consumer expectations. A more personalized experience can actually help educate and incentivize risk avoidance by consumers. When analyzing underwriting, the use of data and algorithms can help insurers identify risk factors that may allow insurers to offer coverage to certain risks at a lower price than in the absence of those tools. When analyzing claims, the use of algorithms can improve the pace of processing, can improve risk ranking, and consumer communication by putting adjusters and managers into files that need particularized attention. Additionally, the use of data and algorithms can help identify fraud and further reduce costs for customers. Ultimately, it is the responsible use of data in the pursuit of accuracy in a highly competitive market that reduces overall costs for consumers. With an acknowledgement of the good algorithms can do comes a similar acknowledgement that the data used to train the models is also important. This is what Commissioner Brain, you were opening with. The training of the models matters. Whether it is provided by consumers themselves or external sources, often your own state and local government records, input data matters, and predictive models, which inevitably rely on some level of generalization, will be most successful in predicting correctly for the largest possible numbers of scenarios when the input data is most accurate. And insurers operating in competitive environments certainly have all the incentive to use the most accurate data available. To be clear, this is not an endorsement of the mandatory collection or inclusion of data unassociated with risk or in contravention of existing laws regarding protected class data. Further focusing on this question of laws and judicial precedent, regulators already have a tremendous amount of authority and adequate mechanisms to gain meaningful insight into insurer activity. It is not uncommon today, when a regulator doesn't understand a particular filing or model, for the insurer to be asked to explain it in greater detail. This is hardly a new phenomenon. The use of artificial intelligence or machine learning should be subjected to no more or less scrutiny than other regulated activities. And disparate impact has no place in any of the analysis regulators should consider, because it has no place in insurance law. I made mention at the outset of how these issues are coming up in a lot of contexts beyond insurance, too. While we should focus on our corner of the world and what we can control, we should also be mindful that we don't exist in a vacuum. Discussions around this topic are in constant flux, and our industry or regulatory community is not alone in feeling many of the pressures we face. But that doesn't mean we should embrace the frameworks of other industries, like housing or mortgage markets, because they're not insurance. And that brings us to the real challenge in front of the regulatory community. If you are going to further examine and analyze the concept of algorithmic bias in insurance, how should you go about it? In the absence of concrete proposals to respond to today, we don't have a preferred answer, of course. But what we can say is that ultimately any recommendations for regulatory analysis or examination in this arena should be flexible, they should be principles-based, they should be tailored to insurance, and they should always take into consideration the size and complexity of the insurers being examined. A great starting point to focus any analysis is on losses and costs. That is a most appropriate basis for analysis. It's consistent with traditional understanding of unfair discrimination. This was the approach used in analysis commissioned by NAMIC, performed by Professor Robert Klein 2 years ago on auto insurance, that has been shared with the Special Committee on Race and Insurance, and will gladly provide to both committees meeting today as well. To the extent that the committee is looking at efforts to validate specific data, algorithms, and methodologies, we also recommend the review of the recent paper by the Academy of Actuaries on the challenges of sourcing protected class data, because this will give you sort of the flavor of what the challenges are and what some of the costs that will come into play are going to be as well. We also recommend taking a look at the Casualty Actuarial Society paper by Roosevelt Mosley of Pinnacle Actuaries on methods for quantifying discriminatory effects in insurance. As I wrap up, I want to emphasize that none of our comments today should come as a surprise, nor should they be taken as confrontational. That is in no way my intent. As in most discussions with the regulatory community, I suspect we agree on far more than we disagree, and we want to remain constructive partners providing useful and respectful feedback as any formal proposals or recommendations are developed in this rapidly evolving space. While policymakers should set guardrails and perform appropriate oversight of the continued use of data, artificial intelligence, and machine learning moving forward, NAMIC will continue to stress the benefits of insurers' use of new data, of traditional data in new ways, and actuarially sound approaches to identifying, quantifying, assessing, and pricing risk accurately and objectively to improve access. We warn against the assumptions that algorithms or mathematical truths have inherently negative consequences if they do not result in equal outcomes. Ultimately, NAMIC believes that what serves policyholders best remains encouraging those practices and products that best match rate to risk. And I think, Commissioner, you said we'll wait for questions till the end. That concludes my remarks. I'm happy to pass it to Karen. Thank you for the time today.
Thank you, Tony, and thank you, Commissioner Brain and Commissioner Stolfi, for the opportunity to come before you today. My name is Karen Melchert. I'm a Regional Vice President in State Relations with ACLI, American Council of Life Insurers, and we are grateful today for the opportunity to speak to you about something that we've actually talked to several of you over the past several months, but are excited to be able to speak to the group at large. So the first pillar of ACLI's economic empowerment and racial equity initiative is expanding access to affordable financial security protection in underserved communities. In order to achieve this goal, companies need to develop new methods for delivering our products. And the development of such technology has caused some concern for regulators as they seek to learn how this new technology is being used and how it is being developed. As Tony mentioned, there is tremendous focus across the country on what we at ACLI refer to as algorithmic accountability. ACLI has been hard at work addressing this issue since August of 2020, after the adoption of the AI principles by the NAIC. And what began as an exercise to define proxy discrimination in the context of insurance has evolved into a blueprint for our algorithmic accountability framework. The goals of ACLI's proposed framework are aligned with our EE&RE initiative. They are to identify any potential unfair discrimination from the use of algorithms, to preserve innovation within the industry, to maintain a holistic view of the relationship between new technologies and their use in underwriting, to maintain consistency with existing underwriting requirements, and to allow for flexibility to accommodate unique uses of algorithms across the industry. The ACLI proposed framework is a risk management framework using a principles-based approach that addresses 4 key requirements. The first is a governance process for the use of algorithms. The second is a testing requirement for such algorithms. The third is reporting requirements for the governance process and the testing protocols. And the fourth is documentation and attestation of the governance process, testing, and reporting. So why a principles-based approach? We believe that a principles-based approach benefits consumers, both by allowing companies flexibility to innovate to meet the unique needs and circumstances of their policyholders, but also by allowing companies to monitor compliance in a way that tailors their risk management framework based on their particular use of algorithms. A principles-based approach also benefits regulators because it eliminates the need for continued modifications to the framework, resulting in new products reaching consumers faster. This is not meant to be a gotcha exercise. Rather, we envision this framework as the foundation for continued dialogue between companies and the regulator. It's also not a check the box exercise either. It is intended to detect and eliminate unintentional unfair discrimination to the extent possible in order to provide our products to all consumers, particularly those in underserved communities. Now, I will say that this framework was initially developed in response to Senate Bill 21-169, adopted by the Colorado's legislature in 2021. We have been working with Commissioner Conway and his staff in the development of regulations to implement that particular law. And that is where we started developing our framework that I'm presenting to you today. And if you'd like to see a more in-depth presentation that really goes into the nuts and bolts of it, I suggest you look at the Colorado Division's website from the July 8th stakeholders meeting. I believe it's been recorded, and you can see a much more nuanced and extensive presentation from Jillian Froment, who was our consultant at the time, but who is now proudly, for us to say, our general counsel at ACLI. But I'm just going to go through some of the aspects of this framework to give you a high-level description of it, and then I can also provide to you, if you'd like, our summary document of the model framework for Colorado that explains that a little bit. But we also envision this as a blueprint for a potential draft a model bulletin or model regulation for the NAIC to possibly use, and for any state to consider using as they address this issue. We will note to start out with that insurance companies are already subject to, thank you, Jason, he just put it in the chat, the link to that page. We're already subject to the Unfair Trade Practices Act, and the NAIC Model Unfair Trade Practices Act doesn't specifically include the prohibition of unfair discrimination based on protected class. Now, our framework is right now based on race, and that's for two reasons. One, that's what started the AI principles when they were first drafted in May or April or whatever of 2020, which included the term proxy discrimination, which is what started this whole exercise for us, and it was based on race. The second reason we're focused on race is because that is the only protected class that we have even a modicum of opportunity to capture in order to do testing. There is no database out there for any of the other protected classes realistically that we could draw from. And there are other methodologies that we can infer race in an attempt to test for unfair discrimination. But even that is not completely foolproof. And we won't get into that today. We can talk about that down the road. But that is something, so when I talk about race and unfair discrimination based on race, that is why we're focused on that today, just for context. This certainly could expand to other things. We're also just focused on underwriting too at this point, because that was the focus that was of our discussion in Colorado. But we also envision that this could be used in other areas of insurance based on the need for that particular industry. P&C is different from life and different from health. We're all a little bit varied. We have a common core of risk-based pricing and the like, but there are different nuances in how we do it. And for life insurance, underwriting is where it's at, because we have one chance to get it right for a risk that could be on our books for 40, 50, 60 years, you name it. So it's important that our risk analysis is accurate and appropriately priced, and that's why we focus our efforts and our framework on underwriting. So for that, I'll just go through our framework briefly, and again, we can provide it to you if you haven't seen it already. I'm happy to provide it to you later. So first of all, the first pillar of our principles-based approach is the development of a governance process, and this should be reasonably designed to determine whether algorithms are A, credible in all material respects, and B, do not result in unfair discrimination. It requires documentation reported to the commissioner, which should include a description of the evaluation process, an explanation of how algorithms are used, and information related to the use of algorithms in predictive models. And third, it includes a summary report of the internal governance structure and outcomes. The second pillar of our framework is the testing requirements for algorithms and predictive models. One, it applies to algorithms and predictive models. It must be designed to detect through testing whether algorithms result in unfair discrimination based on race. And third, it must include a description of the testing methods used, the method used for determining race for testing purposes, and the threshold within the internal governance process that determines whether or not an algorithm may be used. Some people refer this to as a balancing test. Some people refer to this as a bright line test, but it is an internal threshold that all companies have today when they are analyzing the use of a particular underwriting factor or a technology or a different approach on whether or not it meets the actuarial standards and it does not violate the Unfair Trade Practices Act. This is nothing new. As Tony said, doesn't matter if it's a factor on its own or if it's put into an algorithm, it has to meet the requirements we're already subject to. The third pillar of our approach is the reporting requirements to the regulator. And we put this in two different categories, two different parts. It's a confidential report that is filed by, in this instance, any life insurer using algorithms for underwriting purposes. The first part of the report contains documentation of the internal governance processes, testing methodologies, and outcomes from those testing methodologies. Part 2 contains a summary of Part 1 and an attestation that the life insurer has completed its testing in compliance with its framework. Part 1 is not meant to be filed on an annual basis. It is available upon request by the regulator. Part 2 is something we envision being filed annually with a summary of what's in Part 1 and the attestation that they are in compliance with their framework. We fully expect in the beginning of all of this, as this is laid out, if regulators so choose to, that you're going to ask for Part 1 in the beginning, so you fully understand what companies are doing. but it's going to be voluminous, and you've got a lot of companies that you're regulating. So in the interest of saving your eyes and trees, those reports would be filed upon request, and the summary of those reports would be given annually. So that would lay out what has changed, what if we've introduced a new algorithm or we've modified an algorithm because testing has revealed that it's drifted and we want to correct that, and what we've done to correct it. So all of that would be detailed in the second part, and then the attestation by the appropriate officer that they are in compliance. Part one, more detailed. Part two, more of a summary so that you can look and see what's changed and then decide if you want to ask for more information. And again, this is all filed on a confidential basis. And that's the fourth aspect of it is the documentation and attestation requirements. So our framework also addresses the use of third parties, both by companies and regulators. We recognize that this is not an easy task to be done, and that most regulators probably don't have internal expertise. I know a lot of you are now looking to hire data scientists and the like, either externally or internally. And not every company has the capacity to have hundreds of data scientists on staff to be able to do this. So they're going to rely on third-party vendors to help them with that. And then there are companies that use third-party vendors to provide their algorithms and their predictive models. This would not excuse them from having to make sure that those algorithms and predictive models are in compliance with the Unfair Trade Practices Act and do not result in unfair discrimination. We don't know what's in the box is no longer an acceptable answer, and it should not be. So this framework takes into consideration the use of third-party vendors, and we know there are a lot of them out there, and there will continue to be new ones coming up every day as new technology expands and develops. Finally, it does contain confidentiality requirements similar to that which is in ORSA. And that's really how we envisioned this. When we first started talking about it, that's actually where we looked to ORSA first as we started developing this, because this really is intended to be a dialogue between the regulator and the insurer to make sure that what they're doing is transparent and within the confines of the law and to the benefit of consumers. And as we said in the beginning, our intent is not to check the box. It is to make sure to the greatest extent possible that there is no unintentional unfair discrimination within our underwriting practices. We are committed to this, as we have been since we've been working on this project for the last 2.5 years. And as we were before, it was even at the forefront. We want to sell our products to people. We think they deserve the protection, the financial protection that the life insurance industry has to offer. And we want to do whatever we can to make sure that happens in a most effective and fair way. So again, I thank you for the opportunity, and I'm happy to answer any questions at the end of our panel. Thank you so much.
Thank you. And I think we're going to roll right into Dave Snyder. I know, Dave, you have a presentation. There you go. Great.
Thank you, Madam Chair. So I first want to just thank everyone for committing time to this. Happy Friday, and I'm sure that there are many other things that folks would like to be doing, but this is a very, very important issue, and we appreciate the commitment of the NAIC, the regulators, the state regulators. I have no doubt that legislators will be equally interested, and the other stakeholders in this important process. So I represent the American Property Casualty Insurance Association with a broad diversity of membership, all of whom are absolutely committed to working with the NAIC and state regulators on this critical issue. And so next slide, I wanted to briefly outline what our commitment is. We agree with the NAIC on the need to collectively determine how to tackle concerns related to fairness and preventing unlawful discrimination, while seeking improvements that strengthen competitive markets and addressing potential inequities while preserving the risk-based foundation of insurance. These are not mere words. This is a firm commitment. We recognize the need to assure compliance with regulatory standards regardless of how an operation is performed by people or by machines and software. At the same time, there should be a balanced approach that also considers competitive issues in our highly competitive and innovative sector, and the need to protect investments that lead to pro-consumer innovation in coverage, products, support, and services. It is also critically important to recognize that insurance is the transfer of risk, and what may be irrelevant in the pricing of a typical consumer product is very relevant to the fair pricing of insurance. Next slide. All too often, I think we start with a negative, and while that's a very important consideration for all of us, insurers and regulators and all interested parties, let's talk first about the benefits of AI and ML. First of all, better and more efficiently meeting consumer expectations in the digital world. The consumer who just ordered something from Amazon is not expecting a 19th century insurance buying process. They expect rapid and full responses. Secondly, more effectively and efficiently and rapidly responding to settling and paying claims. Examples of that are the auto physical damage claims, and increasingly the ability to settle both exterior and interior property claims, something particularly important in the climate risk environment in which we are now in. More accurately and objectively assessing risk. Telematics is a classic example of that in automobile insurance. And insurance companies are using AI to analyze their performance to improve product offerings, customer service, and compliance. So the old adage about don't throw the baby out with the bathwater certainly applies here. The use of advanced computing and new data are being utilized in the insurance sector in many beneficial ways, speeding claim settlements, improving operations, and increasing the accuracy of risk assessment. Next. Now, moving forward, we all recognize that we have a collective challenge to address what may be new about the use of AI and ML, and to make sure that we're filling the regulatory gaps in a effective, efficient, and in a manner that will, at the same time that we address the issues, preserve the many benefits of AI and ML in the insurance sector. So first and foremost, and you've heard this from others, and I think the NAIC itself has recognized this, that unclear definitions of AI, ML, and other basic terms make it difficult to respond most constructively. An example of that is general definitions of bias do not consider long-standing legislated insurance regulatory and judicial standards. We recognize that, like the industry, regulators have multiple challenges. The first is distinguishing traditionally regulated practices that have simply been computerized from truly new operations and new data. Where are the gaps in current regulation, and how can they best be filled? Very relevant to this discussion, as I mentioned a minute ago, is a concept of bias. While important, it must be placed in the long-established legislated standard of unfair discrimination, which is uniquely relevant to insurance. Again, which is the transfer of risk in exchange for a premium, but reflects the risk being transferred. Next. Another fundamental issue is the importance of robust governance. In our view, it should be a priority. In fact, perhaps the most critical foundational element. And this is an area rapidly evolving with many different stakeholders. One thing to be focused on is the prominent role of human review and decision-making, ultimately, and that governance structures and regulation of governance should be flexible, proportionate, scalable, and explainable. Now, as I said, we believe that governance is a critical element, and there's a wide-ranging national and even international dialogue on it in which we are participating. Several essential elements can be distilled from this dialogue. First, that human judgment needs to be applied where the outcome might be controversial. We are finding that seems to be the case in the insurance sector with the companies we've spoken with. The second concept is proportionality. Again, something very critical to the insurance sector, considering the wide range of sizes and business models which contribute to competition and innovation in prices and coverage. What is truly essential for all players in the insurance sector? The third issue often included in governance discussions is testing for bias. Our initial work there indicates a lack of bias and firm adherence to risk-based pricing. A fourth concept is transparency. Again, the competitive nature of insurance is very relevant to what, how, and to whom business-sensitive, protected, or confidential information should be shared. Now, I want to turn to the attributes of AI risk management framework set forth by the National Institute of Standards and Technology, and we would urge the NAIC to consider these attributes in moving forward. First of all, the AI risk management framework should be risk-based, resource efficient, pro-innovation. Second, it should be consensus-driven. It should provide common language and understanding. It should be easily usable and fit well with other aspects of risk management. It should be useful in a wide range of perspectives. It should be outcome focused and non-prescriptive. It should take advantage of and foster greater awareness of existing standards and guidelines and tools. The framework should support organizations' abilities to operate under applicable domestic and international legal or regulatory regimes, and it should be a living document. So we would urge the NAIC to consider those attributes that are fundamental to the work of the National Institute of Standards and Technology to the NAIC's work going forward, particularly as you focus on the all-important governance issues. Next slide, please. So insurers' use of AI and ML is already subject to legislative, regulatory, and judicial standards. When used for regulated activities, underwriting, pricing, and claim settlement, AI/ML already is extensively regulated. Use of AI and ML should neither expand nor contract regulatory standards and enforcement when used for activities previously conducted purely by humans. The main point is that the fundamental time-tested legislated standards for insurance, risk-based pricing, should continue to rule the day. The fact that AI or ML may be used for an operation should not change the legislated regulatory standards of conduct. In addition, related to definitions, is the courts have defined the elements of disparate impact, and that should be recognized. Now, the subject of disparate impact has come up. It's often been used, and I would urge anyone interested in the concept to read the U.S. Supreme Court's determination in Texas Department of Housing and Community Affairs versus the Inclusive Communities Project. And I give you a cite there because they lay out a balancing approach. It's not just enough to show a potential different impact on a protected minority or protected class, but rather the business can come back and make the point that there's a legitimate business purpose served by this. So we would urge, as the issue of disparate impact comes up, please focus on that Supreme Court decision. Finally, the availability of data on many of these classes sought to be protected is simply not available. Without it, the balancing mandated by law is not possible. Next slide, please. So in conclusion, I reiterated our commitment to the NAIC, to state regulators, and to the other stakeholders who are participating today, that we are committed to working with you to preserve the best of insurers' use of AI and ML, to make sure that it fully complies with legislated regulatory standards, and that we do address underlying issues of systemic racism. The word systemic isn't an accident. It has often resulted from the actions of government and many other players. And we're committed to addressing where systemic racism is evident, as is the case in transportation planning and many other areas, to address that. But simply using the insurance pricing mechanism to do that, A, damages the insurance pricing mechanism and doesn't address the underlying issues. And we are committed to both protecting the insurance mechanism, but also addressing the underlying evidence of systemic racism. We need, in order to move forward in AI and ML, we need for clearer definitions. We believe that governance, regulation, and considerations based upon the attributes set forth by the National Institutes of Standards and Technology would be a great way to proceed in the area of governance. The need to avoid inhibiting beneficial uses of AI and ML, and that we, in the process, look for where there are new gaps created by the use of AI and ML, but that we always adhere to legislated regulatory standards and judicial decisions. Thank you very much, and I very much look forward to the discussion today and in the future as we resolve the many questions that we're discussing today in a way that benefits our policyholders, that assures a competitive insurance mechanism, and that ultimately systemic racism is effectively addressed. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much. Thank you to you, to Dave, to Karen, and to Tony for those presentations. I would urge you, if there are, take the materials and that you referenced in your presentations. If you want to send those links and that information to Denise, we'll make sure that it gets to the group. And now I'm going to turn this over to Commissioner Stolfi to take the next agenda item.
Thank you, Commissioner. Now, looking forward to some presentations from the consumer perspective. I believe Peter will not be speaking today, but we've got 3 presenters: Bernie Birnbaum, Dr. Michael Akamumi, and Morgan Williams, last 2 from the National Fair Housing Alliance. So we're doing pretty well on time. It looks like, again, we've got 45 minutes for these presentations, so that's about 33 after the hour. And so I'll try to keep us to that. Well, I will keep us to that time. So, and remind you if needed. But Bernie, I believe you're up first. We'll turn it over to you.
Oh, Director, just Peter Kotzenberger. I'll speak briefly after the 2 major presentations.
Perfect. Thank you, Peter. That's right. You just don't have any slides. All right. So Bernie, over to you.
Thank you. So thanks to both the committee chairs for scheduling the meeting and for the opportunity to visit with you on ways to advance racial equity in insurance. For those of you who don't know me or the Center for Economic Justice, slides 2 and 3 provide some background. I was formerly the Chief Economist and Associate Commissioner for Policy and Research at the Texas Department of Insurance. I'm honored today to be joined by the experts in testing for racial bias from the National Fair Housing Alliance, as well as my colleague, Peter. If you could move ahead a slide or 2. Thank you. Following the murder of George Floyd, insurer CEOs made strong comments about the need to examine inherent bias and hold themselves and their companies accountable. A broken society fueled by a variety of factors, but all connected by inherent bias and systemic racism. Society must take action on multiple levels and in new ways. But how do we turn these words into meaningful action? Business as usual should not be acceptable. We welcome the ACLI's acknowledgement and engagement, but we're deeply troubled by this PC trades position. Next slide, please. So addressing the impacts of structural racism in insurance goes to the heart of why CEJ works on insurance. Insurance products are essential tools for individual and community economic development. We need only look at the devastation of Hurricane Ian to see how the presence of insurance will make all the difference in recovery for millions of consumers and businesses and hundreds of communities. Addressing structural racism in insurance is essential to create the availability and affordability of essential insurance protection in traditionally underserved areas. Next slide, please. So let's start with the basics and build on key statutory concepts. There are two definitions of fair and unfair discrimination. The first is actuarial fairness. Is there a cost-based distinction among different groups of consumers? If not, the consumer should be treated the same. And despite what the trades say, there's actually a second definition of fair and unfair discrimination, and that's protected class discrimination. Distinctions among groups defined by certain characteristics, typically race, religion, national origin, but others as well, is prohibited regardless of any actuarial basis for such discrimination. So let me ask, why is discrimination on the basis of race prohibited even if there is an actuarial basis for such discrimination? We know that at least for some lines of insurance, that race is predictive of insured loss. Black Americans have a lower life expectancy than white Americans. So why are life insurers prohibited from using race as an underwriting or pricing factor since they can meet the actuarial standard? And if race was predictive of auto insurance claims, would the trades be telling us that insurers should be able to use any factor that's predictive of claims? Well, one reason that race is prohibited may be that the person has no control over their race. They're born with it. But there are plenty of other pricing factors based on characteristics consumers have little or no control over, like age or gender for auto insurance. So again, why do state and federal laws declare racial discrimination as unfair discrimination regardless of actuarial justification? Move to a couple of slides ahead, please. One more, great. So before you is a map of Cleveland. So I'm gonna, back one. What does this map show? Is it the concentration of the minority population in Cleveland? Is it eviction rates, COVID infections and death rates, blood risk, environmentally related illnesses, intensity of policing, predatory lending, or is it federal home loan eligibility from the 1930s to the 1960s? And of course, this is a map of federal home loan eligibility from 1940. The red areas represent parts of Cleveland. Go back, please. The red areas represent parts of Cleveland that were excluded from federal housing loans because Black Americans and other racial minorities were the predominant inhabitants of these areas. But in fact, the map shows all the things that I mentioned, all the legacy of historic racial discrimination. Next slide, please. So let me suggest the reason that race and protected class characteristics are off limits regardless of actuarial fairness is that there's a history of racial discrimination that at best has left a legacy of outcomes that are embedded in the data used for actuarial analysis, and at worst, continues today with racist practices, whether intentional or unintentional, that reflect and perpetuate that historic discrimination. The protected class unfair discrimination insurance recognizes historical discrimination has long-lasting effects that have disadvantaged these groups. The shorter life expectancy of Black Americans is not caused by their skin color, but the historic and ongoing discrimination in housing, healthcare, policing, and other parts of our lives. That's why U.S. federal civil rights and anti-discrimination laws in employment, credit, and housing have always been understood to prohibit not just intentional discrimination, but practices, intentional or unintentional, that result in disparate outcomes based on race. Federal laws and every court that has opined on the issue have recognized both disparate treatment and disparate effect as unfair discrimination. That is, intentional discrimination as well as facially neutral practices that have the same effect as intentional discrimination. So if discrimination on the basis of race is prohibited and has been for many years, why do we continue to see ongoing disparities in the outcomes based on race? Next slide, please. The answer is structural racism. Policies, institutional practices, cultural representations and biases, and other norms that work to reflect and perpetuate based on race. While efforts to improve diversity and inclusion have a critical role, such efforts alone cannot address the systemic and structural causes of racially biased outcomes in insurance. DE&I alone won't stop facial recognition algorithms, for example, from bias against communities of color. Next slide, please. Structural racism affects every institution in our society. In many or most instances, the racial bias is unrecognized and unintentional. Nevertheless, real. Intent cannot be a determining factor of whether there's protected class unfair discrimination. Next slide. So let me offer some current examples of structural racism and how it can impact insurance. Scholars at the Medical College of Wisconsin studied mortgage lending and found that lending bias persists 80 years after the Homeowners Loan Corporation maps, of which we saw an earlier example. They say the results suggest that historical mortgage lending characterizations and settlement patterns are associated with contemporary mortgage lending bias and racial and ethnic settlement outcomes. So even though racial bias in lending is prohibited, it has been for a long time, such bias persists. Why? The answer is institutions and attitudes that reflect and perpetuate that historic discrimination. By the way, why are public health scholars studying mortgage discrimination? Next slide, please. Because structural racism, which is embedded in past and present operations of the U.S. housing market, is a fundamental cause of racial health inequities. They say our findings illustrate ongoing legacies of government-sponsored historic redlining. Structural racism is manifested in historic and current forms of lending disinvestment, predict poor outcomes in Milwaukee's neighborhoods. Next slide, please. A Black professional couple living in a majority white neighborhood bought a home in 2017 for $450,000, paid $42,000 in renovations and upgrades. And then in 2021, they applied for a loan to refinance. Despite significant increases in home prices generally, their appraisal was only $472,000 and the loan was denied. A few months later, the couple applied for another loan, but made a few changes. They removed photographs of the Black family, and the professor asked a white colleague to pose as the homeowner. The appraisal now came in at $750,000, or 60% more. So do you think that the first appraisal was intentional bias, or was it something that reflects structural bias in our society? If you can jump ahead 3 slides. Slides 15, 16, and 17 report on studies showing the formerly redlined areas are subject to more pollution and greater heat. The relationship between historic redlining and current day pollution as associated outcomes is graphic. The most favored areas in the old maps, the green bar in the chart on the right, show the lowest levels of pollution, while the redlined areas, the red bar, shows far greater amounts of pollution. Next slide, please. A recent study found that historically redlined communities were at higher risk of flooding. Of course, the lack of availability and affordability of flood insurance for these communities is also the greatest. Next slide, please. And this is the last example. Policing in the U.S. is racially biased. The U.S. DOJ investigated policing in Ferguson, Missouri, and elsewhere. In Ferguson, the DOJ found the harms of Ferguson's police and court practices are borne disproportionately by African Americans, and there's evidence that this was due in part to intentional discrimination on the basis of race. Cambridge Mobile Telematics is a vendor of telematic algorithms that capture and evaluate driving behavior. In a preliminary study, Cmte found the incidence of bad driving behavior was no different in communities of color than majority white communities. Yet far more motor vehicle and pedestrian citations are issued in communities of color due to more intensive policing. What does this mean? Using MVR reports and court records that incorporate and reflect biased policing will perpetuate that bias into insurance pricing, underwriting, marketing, and anti-fraud algorithms. Next slide. Algorithms reflect and learn the bias in the data and the modelers. Often the patterns it discovers are simply pre-existing societal patterns of inequity and exclusion. Unthinking reliance on data mining can deny members of vulnerable groups full participation in society. The fact that an insurer doesn't use race in an algorithm does not logically or factually result in no discrimination on the basis of race. In fact, the only way to identify and eliminate the impacts of structural racism in insurance is to measure that impact by explicit consideration of race and other protected class factors. Jump ahead a couple of slides, please. So how do we recognize and address structural racism in insurance? First, it's important to state that we're not asking insurers to solve broader societal problems. What we are asking is that insurers examine their practices to avoid contributing to the problem and to take actions to minimize racial bias in insurance. We're asking insurers to do what their leaders promised 2 years ago. Structural racism can manifest itself in insurance in 3 ways, and I want to be precise in these foundational definitions. We'll never agree how to measure racial bias if we don't start from a common definition of what is and what is not protected class discrimination. So I offer these definitions because they track the current statutory language of fair and unfair discrimination. First, there is intentional use of race or disparate intent. The second is proxy discrimination. This is disproportionate racial outcomes tied to the use of proxies for race and not tied to the actual insurance outcomes. In other words, the data source or algorithm is actually predicting race and not the insurance outcome. And then the third definition is disparate impact, disproportionate racial outcomes tied to historic discrimination and embedded in insurance outcomes. Here, the data source is correlated to race, but also predicts the insurance outcome because the racial discrimination is baked into the insurance outcome. So we'll assume that insurers don't intentionally discriminate on the basis of race, and addressing proxy discrimination is relatively easy. The data are not predicting insurance outcomes, so they violate both the actuarial and protected class requirements for fair discrimination. Next slide, please. Addressing disparate impact not only requires empirical analysis and metrics, but public policy considerations for fair trade-offs between algorithmic efficiencies and reducing racially biased outcomes. Does prohibiting the use of a particular data source or consumer characteristic compromise the cost-based or risk-based foundation of insurance? We know that such equity-based policy decisions have been made. That's why intentional use of race is prohibited. It's important to state unequivocally that cost-based foundation of insurance is essential. But there are 2 bases for fair and unfair discrimination, and both must be considered. Next slide, please. How can a regulator or an insurer identify proxy discrimination and disparate impact? Fortunately, there are well-tested statistical techniques for 40 years now that enable an insurer or regulator to determine whether a particular type of data or algorithm is predicting race or the insurance outcome or both. And if both, how much of a proxy for race and how much predictive of the insurance outcome. The slides at the end of my presentation explain in more detail, but the takeaway is that there's a common methodology to test for both proxy discrimination and disparate impact, and such testing is completely consistent with the predictive analytic methods insurers already use. My colleagues from the National Fair Housing Alliance have tremendous expertise in this area and will share their expertise and experience in testing with you. Testing for racial bias shows where the algorithm lies on the continuum from pure proxy to no racial bias. And whether there is proxy discrimination or disparate impact would then depend on the qualitative definitions and thresholds established. Next slide, please. So if we have a structural problem, we need a structural or comprehensive solution. And here are the elements of such a holistic approach in addition to the DE&I efforts that you're engaged in. Testing by insurers of their algorithms and actual consumer outcomes for proxy discrimination, disparate impact based on protected class characteristics. Principles-based governance is not sufficient. Testing of algorithms used in all consumer-facing parts of the life cycle, marketing, underwriting, pricing, claim settlement, anti-fraud. Testing of algorithmic factors simultaneously, not in isolation. Regulatory collection of granular consumer outcome data from insurers, including application-related quotes, as well as policy and claim outcomes to support regulatory testing. Regulatory guidance for bias thresholds and equity trade-offs, and modernizing definitions of and oversight of advisory organizations. I'll briefly talk about a few of these points, but of course I'm happy to expand. Next slide, please. So, while there are some insurer outcomes that require a principles-based approach, because those negative outcomes are rare, such as insolvency or data breach, that's not the case with protected class bias. The ORSA model is not suitable for this issue. Model governance is essential but not sufficient. Testing of actual consumer outcomes for protected class bias is reasonable and necessary, because there are literally millions of such outcomes in every phase of the insurance life cycle that can be analyzed. Another reason for testing of actual consumer outcomes is that it's necessary is just because a model intends to do something is no guarantee the model will actually produce that outcome. Next slide, please. A principles-based approach to address structural racism is not necessary or desirable because uniform methods of testing and evaluation across insurers is possible because all insurers share the same type of consumer outcomes regardless of business model or product. Did the insurer receive an application? Did the application result in a policy? If the policy was issued, what was the premium and coverage provided? Was a claim filed? Was the claim denied or paid? If the claim was paid, how much? Was the claim identified as suspicious or fraudulent? These are common regardless of the line of business or the business model. Next slide, please. It's critical for insurers to be testing all aspects of their consumer-facing operations. While pricing and rating has gotten the most regulatory attention in terms of complex scrutiny, model scrutiny by regulators, it's imperative for insurers to test algorithms used in all aspects of the insurance life cycle. Anti-fraud algorithms are particularly susceptible to reflecting and perpetuating historic discrimination because anti-fraud algorithms identify suspicious claims. If the identification of suspicious claims is racially biased, so will the identification of claims as fraudulent. Claim that's not investigated will not be identified as fraud. Marketing algorithms also raise great concern. The new data sources and algorithms used to micro-target consumers have become the de facto gateway for access to insurance. Next slide, please. Just a few more words on testing of marketing algorithms. In 2005, in a meeting with investment analysts, the CEO of a major publicly traded insurer was effusive about the benefits of the then relatively new use of consumer credit information. Tiered pricing helps us attract higher lifetime value customers who buy more products and stay with us for a longer period of time. That's nirvana. Tiered pricing has several very good, very positive effects on our business and enables us to attract really high quality customers. So the key is to use our drawing mechanism and our tiered pricing to find those that are unhappy with their current carrier, likely to stay with us, likely to buy more multiple products, and that's where tiered pricing and good advertising comes in. 2005 was the stone age of big data analytics. Algorithmic micro-targeting consumers in real time, which didn't exist in 2005, is now the standard. And with this advanced micro-targeting is the greater potential for algorithmic bias. Next slide. Actually, jump ahead 2 slides. One more. Thank you. 2 types of testing are needed for pricing algorithms. First, testing using loss costs, and then testing using the actual premium. The first test, loss cost, addresses the actuarial fairness prong of unfair discrimination, as well as looking for proxy discrimination and disparate impact and predictive factors. The second test addresses the potential bias that may be introduced when insurers move from indicated rates to selected rates. For example, whether price optimization or consumer lifetime value scores introduce racial bias. Testing of premium outcomes must include application data, not just data on policies issued. Inclusion of final quotes that didn't result in a policy are essential for at least 2 reasons. First, you can't meaningfully analyze bias in outcomes if you don't measure folks priced out of the market. The inclusion of data on all applications has been part of the Home Mortgage Disclosure Act data reporting from inception. Second, analyzing quote data will reveal the outcomes of the insurer's marketing algorithms and consequently whether those algorithms are producing racially biased outcomes. Next slide. Holistic testing, not just individual factors in isolation. Over the last several decades, much of the focus on efforts to address racial bias in insurance has been on data sources that are highly correlated with race, with calls to ban those factors. And while insurers should surely not be using data sources and factors that are proxies for race and not predictive of insurance outcomes, testing for racial bias must be of the entire algorithm and the data sources used for at least 2 reasons. First, eliminating one factor may simply shift the racial bias to another factor instead of eliminating it. Testing of the algorithm is designed to eliminate proxy discrimination and identify disparate impact of the entire algorithm. Second, multivariate testing can eliminate correlations with race and reveal the factor's true contribution to explaining the insurance outcome and provides a statistical basis for addressing disparate impact. Next slide, please. Of course, there need to be regulatory standards for bias thresholds and equity trade-offs. Insurers need guidance on what degree of proxy discrimination should lead to prohibiting the use of that data source or factor. How can an insurer utilize alternate data sources to maintain the algorithm's efficiency while reducing disparate impact? And what trade-offs between reducing disparate impact and weakening the algorithm's efficiency is reasonable? If we could change an algorithm to eliminate 95% of the racial bias at a cost of 5% of statistical predictive strength, would that be a fair trade? And I want to just finish with a note, next slide, please, on risk-based pricing. The PC Trades and other insurer advocates routinely seek to justify pricing freedom, the use of any data source or characteristic of the consumer, vehicle, property, built, or natural environment, if it's predictive of risk, because more refined risk classification is always better and more fair, they claim. And you heard that today. This formulation is problematic for a number of reasons, but for our purposes today, there are a couple of key points. First, the purpose of insurance is to create a risk pool through which individuals can transfer risk to that pool. Risk-based pricing is a means to manage that mechanism safely and fairly and promote loss mitigation. It is not the purpose of insurance. Testing for and addressing structural racism in insurance is 100% consistent with and improves risk-based and cost-based practices. An unfettered risk-based pricing without attention to structural racism will reflect and perpetuate historic discrimination and worsen availability and affordability of insurance for traditionally underserved communities. So with that, I'd like to turn this over now to my colleagues from the National Fair Housing Alliance. Thank you.
Just to note, we've got about 20 minutes, 21 or so minutes left. So just be mindful of that, please. Thanks.
Hi, sorry, go ahead, Morgan.
No, I was gonna invite you to kick things off.
Hi, everyone. Thank you for having me. Just a little bit about my background. So I come from the traditional math background with a special interest in applying mathematics to systems, which include biological systems, financial systems, and also social systems. And when it comes to financial systems, so I've worked in insurance and then also in banking sectors. And specifically when it comes to insurance, I've had the privilege of developing statistical models, machine learning models, when it comes to marketing use cases, and also when it comes to underwriting, as well as insurance pricing or rating. Now, based on the work that I currently do with the National Fair Housing Alliance, so we actually focus on removing bias or discrimination that may be associated with algorithms. And that includes statistical algorithms being used to develop statistical models, and then also the sophisticated algorithms that are being used in machine learning systems. And more recently, we published a framework that could be used to remove or identify risks that are associated with algorithmic systems. And once the risks are identified using the framework that we released, we also believe that the NIST, or the National Institute of Standards and Technology Risk Management framework, could actually be used to manage risks that are identified by the auditing framework that we published. And also our interest cut across use of algorithms in rental assistance, rent scoring solutions. And then also when it comes to factors or protected classes and methodologies that can be used to infer them, So we also focus on that. So with that, I'll pass it on to you, Morgan, to kick off the to introduce yourself and also kick off the presentation.
Thank you, Michael. And for folks that want to find information on the National Fair Housing Alliance Tech Equity Initiative, you can go to our website there. I'm Morgan Williams, General Counsel with the National Fair Housing Alliance. I lead our office's legal affairs across a range of fair housing enforcement, compliance, and policy matters. We're working with federal and state regulators across a range of housing finance, lending, valuation, and other industry sectors that are grappling with developments involving AI ML, and we're glad to join in the discussion today. Compliance and regulatory oversight ultimately flow from the basis and scope of legal liability. This has been true historically and remains the case, involving more complicated and still developing algorithmic systems. Accordingly, to build off of the remarks this afternoon, I'll briefly unpack these bases of civil rights causes of action, involving a review of some fair housing insurance cases and compliance principles, and turn it over to my colleague, Dr. Akinwumi, to outline principles of proxy testing as a means for assessing algorithmic discrimination. And we'll try to keep this pretty brief to the next 15 minutes and allow our colleague Peter some remaining minutes for comment. Next slide, please. As noted in the presentation, civil rights laws prohibit policies and practices when there is evidence of intentional discrimination, known as disparate treatment, as well as when, even without evidence of discriminatory intent, there is evidence of discriminatory effect, called disparate impact. There's different ways to prove disparate treatment, involving various forms of direct and circumstantial evidence, but we'll focus on disparate impact significantly. There was mention of the Texas Department of Housing and Community Affairs versus Inclusive Communities 2015 Supreme Court decision, which held that disparate impact liability is cognizable under the Federal Fair Housing Act, and detailed this three-part standard broadly upheld among the courts and consistent with the 2013 HUD rule outlining this standard, burden-shifting standard, including the 2016 supplemental guidance applying that standard to insurers. And as the slide indicates, the disparate impact standard of liability involves this burden-shifting approach. First, the plaintiff has the burden of establishing that this neutral policy disproportionately affects a protected class on the basis of race or national origin or sex or otherwise. Then the defendant can assert that there's a legitimate business justification. And if they do so, then the burden shifts back to the plaintiff to identify if there is any less discriminatory policy or practice to meet that justification. These frameworks translate well into review and assessment of insurance servicing models, including those using AI and machine learning. Although more guidance from those providing industry oversight on the appropriate steps insurers should take would be helpful to ensure robust, consistent enforcement compliance. Next step, please. So just to detail the application of these causes of action, I'm going to feature two decisions that involve our office, the National Fair Housing Alliance, pursuing federal legal claims. The first here, is in the context of the fact that in the late 90s and early 2000s, the National Fair Housing Alliance pursued fair housing enforcement claims against a host of major insurance companies because they used these standards in their underwriting and pricing. And this enforcement was based on data analysis in dozens of cities throughout the US that showed strong disparate impact in communities of color, notably in regards to legitimate business justification defense. There was the assertion of a moral hazard as proffered is such a justification in some of those enforcement actions. That is the idea that insurance promotes risk-taking for personal gain. And that was debunked in the course of the litigation. and underscores the extent to which the justification needs to be really based in some legitimate actuarial analysis. Next slide, please. Then the second case, briefly touch on here, just involves a more recent decision involving claims under local DC statutes regarding source of income, as well as federal disparate impact claims, asserting discrimination on the basis of race and sex against African-American female-headed households. This is a policy in which Travelers Insurance denied commercial habitational insurance to landlords who rented to housing choice voucher tenants. Those with Section 8 vouchers. And that resulted in a decision that outlined sort of post-inclusive communities, that is post the Supreme Court decision application of that standard of liability to the insurance industry. Next slide here. This slide is just extrapolating from those two bases of liability, disparate treatment and disparate impact. There are then have emerged these two methodologies for testing. And in the interest of time, I'm going to just note that these are sort of fundamentally both quantitative methods and important steps to take. Next slide, please. But that additionally, or in conjunction with, insurance and financial institutions implementing these quantitative statistical tests, they are augmented in robust compliance management systems with these more holistic compliance controls. And to these, meant to add two, which I'll just post in the chat. One is just that item 5 there involves, of course, both fair housing and fair lending. And the second is just compliance testing, which is something that we've done routinely. These principles, really in conjunction with the testing principles noted in the prior slide, really translate into a framework for engaging in consideration of evaluation of more complicated AI and machine learning models. And to Michael's reference earlier of our framework for auditing algorithms for bias, a lot of this is embedded in that framework. I will then now turn it over to Michael to cover sort of the application of proxy testing for assessment of algorithmic discrimination, and suggest maybe the next slide would be a good segue.
Next slide, please. So statistical models or machine learning models, they are often go-to technique in insurance underwriting or insurance rating. Usually a linear relationship is often assumed between the information that is available at the time of insurance application and premium components like claim frequency, claim severity, or loss cost. And so if we if you assume that the information available at the time of application are codified by X, and then the objective or the target of interest is, for example, modeling of claim frequency and severity, then such a linear relationship between those variables could actually be represented by the equation that we see here. So, for example, when it comes to insurance rate making application, which relies heavily on a type of model called generalized linear model as a use case. So the systemic component of such model is determined by the weight that you see in that equation. And usually that determination comes after efforts have been made to make sure that legally allowed variables are included in the model. And also the variables that are being used to make such prediction, there is no collinearity or co-independence among those variables. And we also determine that the explanatory variables, which are information available at the time of application, they're actually statistically related to the target or the objective that we're trying to predict. And in that case, so the weight that we see in that equation, they actually tell a lot about how much the information that is available at application time contributes to the differences or variation that are seen in the variable that is being predicted. So there are often instances where an insurer may want to mitigate against factors like demographics or jurisprudence across state boundaries. In such scenarios, then we use control variables to actually mitigate such effects. And one typical way of introducing those control variables is what is represented in the second equation. So we have a component that represents information that is typically considered during application time. And then the second component represents considerations that allow insurers to mitigate against a certain effect. Next slide, please. Now, as my colleague mentioned, when it comes to Fair Housing Act or Equal Credit Opportunity Act, so there are variables that are legally protected, like race, color, national origin, and disability. These variables are not allowed, they are prohibited from being used directly in the model. Otherwise, then one is going to be exposed, or the company will be exposed to discrimination by intent. So in the case of the prohibited variables, which cannot be used directly, then one can think of a case of, let's say, race as a factor. Then in order to test for any possible discriminatory effect of by some of the variables that are already included in the model, then you could actually introduce race as a control variable, which is actually represented in the third equation here. So if we think of, if we go back to one of the slides that was presented by Bonnie, so we see there that he actually clarified the different types of possible discrimination. Now, if we just focus on proxy discrimination or discrimination by disparate intent, then it's possible to actually test for that by using machine learning algorithms like clustering techniques. And what that means is that the information that are used to decide or determine, for example, the price at the time of application could be used to actually group or bucket applicants into different groups. Now, if there is a situation where the different subgroups that are identified, they actually have varying or different effects on the target or the objective that is being predicted, then that may actually lead to proxy discrimination or disparate treatment within that subgroup. Because the reason why we cluster them is we expect those subgroups to be related by the information that is being used to determine or predict, for example, claims frequency or severity. Now, if that relationship is now established and we still see that there is disparity in outcomes that is being predicted, then that may actually be an indication that proxy discrimination is ongoing or disparate treatment is also happening. Next slide, please. Now, once we do the testing that actually involves the use of a control variable, generally there are 4 possible outcomes. So in this case, we're just considering a single control variable, which is in this case a race. But this test can also be extended to other protected classes. But just bear with me for a moment and focus on race as the control variable that we're trying to test for. So if we look at the possible outcomes, the very first outcome is that the result indicates that the control variable is not statistically related to the objective that we're trying to predict, which in this case could be frequency, severity, or loss cost, or even loss ratio. And that there is marginal change in the effect that is actually codified by the weight of the information in this equation. Now, if that is established, then the recommendation is that there is no proxy discrimination happening, and neither is do we have disparate impact So in that particular scenario, that model may be used. Now, the second possible outcome is where there is proxy discrimination, but there is no disparate impact. And what that means is that after running the test, the diagnostic test, one observed that the weight of the control factor or variable introduced is statistically significant, and there is a statistical difference or significant difference in the weight of those information that were used at the application time. So if that is observed, then one needs to actually remove the proxy and also rebuild the model. Now, in my previous slide, I did mention briefly the testing for multicollinearity. So the assumption here is that the variables or the factors that are being used to explain the observed differences in the predictors, they are not linearly related. So in that case, the recommendation when proxy discrimination is established and there is no disparate impact could actually be extended to as many variables or factors that are included in the model. Next slide, please.
Doctor, just to jump in, we've in order to keep with the time, we've only got about 2 or 3 more minutes.
Okay.
Peter wanted to share a few words, so if you could.
All right, thank you. So I'll just briefly go through this particular slide and the next 2 slides. So the third possible outcome is that we establish that there is no proxy discrimination, but then when you look at the impact or the effect of the control variables that was introduced, we see large disparities in the objective that we're trying to predict. And just like Morgan mentioned in his section, then that really calls for search for less discriminatory alternative. And the last possible outcome is that there is both proxy discrimination and disparate impact. And of course, that requires following the recommendations under the first or second possible outcome. The next slide, please. Now, when it comes to testing for proxy discrimination, we understand that some of the variables or factors protected classes required may not be available, but there are statistical methods that could be used to actually infer those protected information from information that is available on record. For example, the Bayesian improved surname geocoding is, and also its variants, is one of the so many methods, though they have their limitations, that could actually be used to infer race information. The next slide, which I believe is the last one. There are also sophisticated machine learning algorithms, and some of them we're actually testing them at the National Fair Housing Alliance that could be used to infer information, protected information like age, gender, and even race from images and also other biometrics information that are available. And I believe with that, I've come to the end of the presentation. So I'll turn it to Peter to chime in.
Thank you, Doctor. And Peter, I think you were planning on being quick, but please be very quick.
I'll be very, yes, I want to make sure we get to the questions and everything. Thank you for the time. I just simply want to address a few points made by some of the industry presentations. I won't repeat what's been said, except maybe the first one. First of all, we hear this constantly. Fairness in insurance is determined by actuarial fairness, which is, yes, is the traditional definition of unfair discrimination. Well, they have this exactly backwards. Actual fairness, actuarial fairness, the correlation, is an element in determining what is fair in insurance. It doesn't consist of it. Insurance regulation doesn't exist to buttress or to champion actuarial or risk-based pricing. Risk-based pricing is a very important element of those factors. It doesn't determine your regulatory structure, and there's plenty of examples of this, including where actuarial fairness is either ignored or simply one factor. And the best example I can think of is that we don't allow pre-existing conditions to be used in underwriting most ACA-compliant health insurance plans or in group insurance generally. Clearly relevant, clearly very relevant, but there are other goals. Fairness is not defined by only the consideration of actuarial fairness. Second, any new regulation should be done within the existing relative regulatory framework, and it's already well regulated. Well, first, that's simply not correct. There is not a sufficient regulatory structure or one that's addressed to it. Otherwise, not a single person here would have been doing this work for the last couple of years. But more relevant, it brings in there are new challenges which we build upon existing regulatory structures, but we're not confined to it. The idea that any new regulation must fit in and not expand the traditional regulatory environment or structures that exist now, which is a statement made, would mean that law and regulation and consumer protection and safety are tied only to the remnants of the past. They can't advance, that they can't recognize changes in economic situations, technology changes, societal changes, and of course they have to. That's the point. So there's no reason that that we're limited only to, for example, the definition of actuarial fairness and unfair discrimination as we're told it exists. And to think that laws can't develop and new laws provide is inaccurate and laid by hundreds of years of history in our country. Third, we hear a constant theme, and for years, and it is, I'm not going to end on a negative point, but it is heard here today, and that is the need to study and evaluate. Well, I'm a law professor. I'm the last person to say we don't need to study and evaluate and make careful decisions, but that's not what's actually going on here. For example, the idea that we must go for years, or that we must understand and define the basic terms, which itself is a substantial undertaking, and before any substantive regulation can proceed, is not a subtle attempt simply to say to delay any substantive regulation using the need or the perceived threat using the need to further study and achieve a consensus on terms which consensus may not ever be achieved if that includes any opposition, and B, in which is unnecessary to move forward. What would if in fact there was that agreement to let's just define the terms before we move to substance, then this will quickly turn into a debate of endless white papers and comments and minutiae, an academic debate if you want to use that term, that's irrelevant to the points here and irrelevant to insurance regulation. It's not how regulation works. It needs to be heard, interested parties need to be heard, it needs to be considered, but it needs to move forward. The request for substantive study, this increased study, including the need to define terms that are adequately defined or could be easily already, the AI principles, for NAIC's AI principles, for example, that provide an excellent foundation, should allow the NAIC to go forward as well as the states very quickly for two reasons. One, primarily because to protect consumers, insurance consumers. And two, because if the NAIC and the states don't proceed, and they have a unique ability in insurance regulation, both because of their authority and because of state ability to examine models up front and to specifically regulate them, which is not necessarily true in other areas. If they don't fall to other regulatory bodies with little knowledge of insurance, little interest necessarily in insurance, and likely not regulations tailored to meet the needs of the industry and to meet the needs of policyholders and state regulators. So the issue can easily be taken away from state insurance regulators if it's not already handled well. And that's not in anyone's interest. So I thank you for your time.
Okay, great. Thank you, Peter. All right, Commissioner Berrain, I think you're going to help orchestrate the comment period. So turn it back to you.
Thank you. So thank you to all of our speakers so far today. Part of the goal today was to provide opportunities for interested persons to be able to comment. And so I want to make sure that we spend the bulk of the rest of our time, we have about 20 minutes left, making that opportunity available to you. So if you would like to be heard, let me ask you to raise your hand. I'd like to ask people respectfully to limit your remarks to 2 or 3 minutes. And I'm going to ask Denise perhaps to help me because I'm really bad at identifying hands. So if there is someone, an interested party that would like to speak and hasn't had the chance to do so at any of our events, now's the time to be heard.
Hi, and Commissioner, I'm here. I don't see any hands raised yet, but while they're working toward that, I did see one question in the chat from Brendan Bridgeland. I can read it, and Brendan, maybe you can jump in and let me know if you feel like your question's already been answered and if this is the right time to pose that question.
I don't think it's been answered, so
Okay.
go ahead. Thank you.
All right, I'll read it for you then. Thank you. Brendan asks, what steps are being taken? He's asking this question of the industry representatives. What steps are being taken to prevent duplication of risks by same data categories? For example, AU programs may analyze both credit scores and bankruptcy data, which appears to be using the same factor twice via different data elements, which may be rating on the same factor twice. So I'm not sure if there's any or any of our 3 industry presenters would like to address that question, or anybody else on the line. Or possibly even one of our other technical experts.
Denise, this is Bernie. I'm happy to answer that, if that's okay.
Yeah, I think we can take a minute or two. I don't think we've seen any other hands. And so, Bernie, if you want to try to provide a brief answer, and then if there are no other interested parties, I'm going to open up to questions from the from regulators.
Okay, and now I am, Commissioner, seeing a couple hands raised. So we have Michael DeLong and then David Snyder.
So Brendan asks, what if you're using factors that are correlated with one another? How do you prevent double counting or something like that? And the answer is that insurers long ago started using what's known as multivariate analysis, which is simultaneously analyzing a variety of factors. You're looking at all the factors at the same time. And when you do that in, say, a generalized linear model, what happens is that removes the correlation among the predicted factors and better identifies each factor's unique contribution to explaining the outcome. And that's why the addition of race as a control variable is such a useful tool. It removes the correlation between race and the other factors, and then reveals whether those factors are simply predicting race or predicting the insurance outcome. Thank you.
Thank you, Bernie. I'm going to guess that Dave raised his hand to respond.
Sure. The issue of testing is really quite fundamental and quite rapidly evolving. There's no singular sort of testing methodology. Bernie has suggested one. There are loss ratio methods and others. And I think the industry is trying to look at which of these testing models best sort of serve the purpose of determining whether there's anything going on that is socially unacceptable. So I think this issue of testing is something we'll be talking a lot more about. We're looking at some alternatives for testing. I don't think there's a meeting of the minds as to which testing mechanism is the best. Bernie proposes one. Again, their loss ratio test, the BISG method that was mentioned a minute ago by the fair housing folks, is something we've looked at as well. So this is clearly an area of cooperation in the future. How and when and what testing methodology is the most useful. But I think clearly the effort on the part of the industry is accuracy and risk assessment accuracy, tested both internally and in a competitive market. If a group is being overcharged, there are going to be companies that are going to get in there to try to right those folks. So I think that this is again just ending where I began, which is the issue of testing is one which is under active consideration, and there's no one way to do it yet. And we are looking at the pluses and minuses and the outcomes from different testing methodologies. But I'm sure we'll be talking a lot more about testing in the future. Thank you.
Thank you. And I think Mr. DeLong, and I the Q&A is helpful, but what I mostly want to make sure of is that people who have something they want to say have the opportunity to say it here today. And I know we don't have lots of time, but so Mr. DeLong.
Thank you. This is Michael DeLong from Consumer Federation of America. Just wanted to say thank you for organizing this. I support the remarks made by Bernie and Peter, and I wanted to reemphasize that we know that there's a need for strong public input on this, and also for ensuring that all sides are heard. But also, we don't want like regulations and stuff to be delayed and delayed and delayed. And I wanted to strongly say we support Peter's point that don't delay substantive regulations by citing the need to achieve a consensus, especially if it can't be achieved, because it's important to ensure that people have fair access to insurance and don't encounter unfair discrimination. And justice delayed is justice denied.
Thank you very much for those comments. Is there anybody else who wants to be heard with new comments? And I don't want to spend too much time getting in the answer. I think we heard from Bernie and we heard from David on sort of that question. So do we have other people who have comments to make more generally?
Dr. Akinwumi has raised his hand as well.
Thank you. Just a quick clarifying comment. When it comes to the testing, I think there is one about looking at the variables or the factors that you're using in the model. And that's what Bonnie's comment is about, like approaches that could be used. Now, what David mentioned, which is looking at loss ratio, that is really focusing on the outcome. And so I would just encourage everyone in the audience to actually look at the PPM framework for testing or auditing algorithms, because it makes that distinction clear. And what we're really calling for here is, before we get to the outcome, we need to actually test the variables or factors that are being used to make predictions about the loss ratio or other variables that are of interest.
Thank you. Thank you very much. So any other hands that have been raised for comments? Because if not, we can open it up to questions for any of the panelists or participants by any of the regulators on the call. Well, I know my fellow regulators aren't shy. They'll just unmute themselves and ask questions. So I think probably we don't have questions. And so then let me take the last 11 minutes and throw it open to questions from interested parties. I know we had Brendan's, which is great. Are there other questions that people would like to throw out there for discussion?
Looks like Karen has her hand up.
I do, thank you. I just like to make one follow-up comment. I do think it's important to have defined terms so we all are singing from the same hymnal. That's not a delay tactic. It's a necessary foundational part of making sure that there's uniformity across the industry. And I know that the NEAC in this particular, the H committee has been working on that in your listening sessions and your discussions that have been commissioner only. We applaud you for that. We think it's important to have not only defined terms as we cross different jurisdictions, but also within different committees at the NEAC, the same term needs to mean the same thing. So I'm a little surprised to hear a law professor say we don't need definitions to move forward, but Peter, I'm going to look at your classes and see if I can take one online. That'd be fun. But I do think it's important, and we're not doing this to, clearly ACLI has demonstrated that we're working on this and we want to move forward, but we would be the first also to say that we need to know the definitions that we're working under in order to move forward on the same consistent level. Thank you.
If I could just quickly.
I was just going to say, Peter, I know you want to respond. Go ahead.
Okay, thanks. No, I didn't say, it was, didn't mean that there shouldn't be definitions. Any regulation or statute almost always has to have them. It's just that, as suggested and as presented by the property casualty trades, that discussion itself would be, quote, a substantial undertaking and would take years. That's what we don't need. And controversial terms and definitions are just done in far less time in federal and state law, including insurance regulation. So it's not the lack of definitions, is that as presented, it is an obvious tactic to delay any substantive work, I think, for years.
So this is Bernie. I agree that key definitions are foundational to what we're trying to do. And we should take the time we need to do it. I don't think we need years to do it. But remember that there are a variety of methods for testing for racial bias, but they all have basically one thing in common. They're trying to remove the correlation between race and the other predictive factors. So the method that I included in my slides, which is something that has been used in other industries for decades, is just one example, but there are many ways of doing that. But they all share in common the approach of removing the correlation between race and the other predictive variables and seeing what happens to those predictive variables. If once you remove the correlation with race, does that other predictive variable still have any predictive power? If it was simply predicting race, then the answer would be no, and that's what the statistical analysis would show. The other thing that's really critical to point out is what we're asking insurers to do is what they already do when they develop models. They look for the predictive power of particular variables. They use control variables when necessary to avoid some types of bias. So there's no rocket science involved here. And while there are certainly issues to be developed and discussed, it's not something that should take years. Thank you.
Thank you, Bernie.
Mr. Snyder has his hand up, Commissioner.
Please.
Sure, I don't want to cut off a comment or question from a commissioner. I'll certainly defer and be pleased to make a comment after that. Thank you.
No, I really was just going to ask if there were any other hands raised, so
Okay.
please.
Thank you very much. So let me end on a positive note here so that we can start our weekends and understand that we are in fact making progress. There are a couple key areas, I think, of agreement. The first is that governance is important, and the work of the National Institute of Standards and Technology is something worthy of some significant review and engagement and consideration by the NAIC. Several groups, not just the industry, have mentioned that. The second thing is that we all share the concern with structural racism and how it's manifested and what we as a society can do about it. Now, there's a little bit of disagreement as what is the role of insurance. We believe our role is to price according to risk, and that we should be advocates, as we are, in supporting federal infrastructure and other processes and funding to address and undo the structural racism that exists in transportation planning and in all other areas of society. A third area is that the testing issue is complicated. There are multiple ways to do it. And finally, a desire not to delay for delay's sakes, but to get it right, because the stakes here are very high. We all know what those stakes are. We deal with them every day. It's one of the most fundamental markets for American society, and state regulators have gotten it right over more than or nearly 200 years. So in following a process exactly, Madam Chair, that you've constructed is how we're going to get to the right answer at the right time. So thank you.
Thank you. Denise, do we have any other hands?
No, Commissioner, I don't see any other hands up.
Okay. Well, let me just say, first of all, let me give Commissioner Stolfi the opportunity to make any closing remarks.
Thank you, Commissioner. No, I just want to thank all the presenters for sharing that information, for helping this dialogue along. I know we've got a lot more discussion that's going to come, and I agree it'd be great to get something, figure out what we're going to do and do it as soon as we can. So thanks. Back to you, Commissioner.
Thank you. And I echo Commissioner Stolfi's thanks for all the presenters today. It was a good discussion, and I like the fact that we were able to have some real dialogue towards the end. I think that's always very valuable, and we don't spend enough time with the interested party Q&A, because I think that often yields really good thoughts. And I am committed, as well as Commissioner Stolfi, in moving us forward with reasonable haste, because we've done a lot of foundational work, we've done a lot of really good work, and we are coming together to talk about kind of what the next steps are here, and that balance between a reasoned approach and getting it right, but at the same time not allowing this to be an elongated process that really prevents us from getting the regulatory work done. So that is, I think, a commitment that all the commissioners can make to you, that we want to see this move forward and move forward quickly. So with that, I will return 3 minutes of your Friday afternoon to you, and I wish everybody a very safe and happy weekend. And for my fellow commissioners, I will look forward to seeing you, most of you, in person next week. Take care. Thanks.
Thank you.